One of the other things that struck me, I guess, when you read legalese, is sort of the absence of the whole poetic side of relationships. I mean, that's what is found in the Quran. Your garments into each other, and put love and mercy in your hearts, and perhaps the legal language just takes it out, or
right. Yeah, I mean, these guys were doing something very specific here. This is a genre of writing in which they were concerned with ethics. It's not all, this is what you can enforce in a court, this you can't enforce. Some of it is, ideally, it's recommended that you do this particular thing, or it would be a good idea for you to do this, or I would discourage you from doing that. But, they're really not dealing in these texts with those things. On the other hand, Imam Shafi'i wrote poetry, and in some of his poetry he took a slightly different perspective on some of these things. So I think we have to really be very aware that this is one piece of a very large picture, right? It's one piece of the picture of intellectual culture. It's one piece of a picture of legal culture, right? Because what's actually happening in the courts is very, very different than what's happening in the ideal in the books.
And when sort of for the final question, in terms of practical relevance, if a Muslim is reading your book and coming across these legal concepts, ways of thinking that are very different from modern sensibilities, what are some recommendations you would give for sort of navigating? What are some possibilities that we have?
Yeah. So one of the reasons that I think thinking about the 9th century, thinking about history in general, can be useful if potentially not immediately relevant in the way some other things might be, is that it's really helpful to recognize that our ways of thinking about things aren't the only ways they've ever been thought of. That it's possible to think differently, but also that we got here from a particular place, and it might be possible to do things differently in the future. I think Americans in particular tend to be perhaps suffering from a kind of collective historical amnesia. Like the 70s are sort of the distant past. I mean, maybe this is partially because I teach a lot of undergraduates, and they weren't alive during the Cold War, and so if I say, oh well, and those Russians, and they kind of say, well, yeah, like the Russian mafia, like they sort of, it's ancient history, and it seems irrelevant. So in that sense, the fact that people don't realize that it was really common up until some point in the 20th century for ordinary Christian wedding ceremonies to have the bride promise to love, honor, and obey, while the husband would promise to love, honor, and cherish. And I say that to people now, and they say, yeah, right, you're making that up. But it was very, very common. And so I think there's a part of the smugness that goes along with contemporary certainties is in part, a failure to recognize that the ancient world is the ancient world, and we have to think about it. But I think part of what can be useful about thinking about this is also thinking about, well, what parts of this are we still carrying with us today that we're not comfortable with? If we still think of talaq as being this kind of central Islamic institution, well, just thinking about the fact that its centrality in Muslim marriage law perhaps derives from the ease with which the jurists were able to make this other kind of comparison, does that perturb us enough to rethink how we might treat talaq today? I mean, I'm really not trying to say anything particular about the contemporary situation, and I'm certainly not attempting a kind of prescription about where we ought to go from here, except that I think having more data to think with about this incredibly rich and also in some ways deeply problematic tradition can only really help us.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes. Professor Kecia Ali, and we're ready for questions and answers from the audience.
Maybe use this. Yeah, some microphone.
alaikum. I have this question that I guess a lot of us have about the bond maidens or handmaidens, and when it says in the Quran that they are halal. How was it dealt with in early Islam? Was it already existing, and it was one of those things that just continued? And was it both ways? Your men's service and your women's service also?
So that's a really terrific question, and I actually say rather a lot about this in the book. Certainly, what we know about Arabia at the time of the Prophet and his community is that one of the permissible, socially acceptable modes of sexual relationship was between a man and his own slaves. What exactly slavery meant, the Quran says, "Ma malakat aymanukum," right? What your right hands own or possess, that term malaka again, right? What that meant exactly, are these people who were captured in war? Are they people bought and sold? Certainly marriage by capture, as far as we can tell, was reasonably common tribal practice. We do know, to the extent that we're willing to rely on sources like Bukhari and Muslim and other hadith collections of the Sirah literature, that the Prophet Muhammad had a concubine. Her name was Maria Qibtiyya. She was a gift, just to show you how common this was in the ancient world, beyond the borders of Arabia. She was a gift from the Byzantine commander of Alexandria. We have actually an expert on her in the audience who wrote a master's thesis about her. So, and there were other women as well. Certainly he was not the only member of the community to do so. And this became enshrined in jurisprudence as a perfectly permissible practice. Unlike in certain other legal systems, the children born to these women were eventually deemed free and legitimate, and the women became what was known as ummahat al-awlad, mothers of children, and they would be freed on their master's death. So this was a permissible form of sexual relationship that relied on milk al-yamin, ownership by the right hand, which was very much like milk al-nikah. And so, the discussions where I said sort of purchase of a slave, marriage contract with dower payment to the wife, these are often the cases that are discussed jointly. As far as women taking their male slaves as concubines, that was a big no-no. Okay? It really almost nobody talks about it, right? It's just so far outside what people are willing to think about. But there is this one wonderful anecdote which shows up in an 8th century legal text, where this woman comes to the Caliph Omar and she says, well, I've taken my slave as a concubine, and my male relatives are getting kind of upset about this. And Omar says, well, what on earth possessed you to do this? And she says, well, men have slaves and they have sex with them, and I have a slave, and so why not? And Umar goes and consults with a bunch of the companions and comes back and says, well, she's given the book of God an interpretation that is not its interpretation, and that's kind of his answer to this. So, and then Imam Shafi'i comes along 150 years later, and he actually, this earlier situation is sort of ad hoc, right? It's a problem, and they deal with it by saying, yeah, not permitted. Imam Shafi'i, by then using analogy, by then thinking systematically about what this might mean, is confronted by this sort of hypothetical questioner who says to him, why is it that a woman can't take her male slave as a concubine like a man takes his female slave as a concubine? And he says, the woman is the one who is taken as a concubine, who is married, right, in the passive, mankuh. And the man, he is the one who takes a concubine, who marries. Now, what's particularly interesting about this is that the questioner is asking about a free woman and a male slave whom she owns, right? The response is about a free man and a female slave whom he owns, because in Shafi'i's thought, this wasn't the only position. Malik thought male slaves could take concubines, but Imam Shafi'i says no, because you have to be able to own property to do this. it would have to be a free man. So he just, this whole edifice of thought, yes, property is important, yes, all of these other things matter, but when it comes specifically to the question of sex, for him it's the gender of the person that's at stake. And it's not an accident that he moves from the question about concubinage to precisely the question about marriage, right? For him, that's where it belongs.
I have two sort of anecdotal information I would like you to please see how, first of all, the accuracy of the information, secondly, how they apply to current understanding. One is that at the time of Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him, a young man wanted to get married, and he definitely had to have a dowry, but did not have any materialistic means of satisfying the requirement. The Prophet tells him, teach her the verse of Quran. So then this becomes, okay, if the person is holding the marriage contract, authority on the contract, how does this apply? The second is that the, I forgot the second one.
Okay, so let me ask a clarifying question. What do you mean the person holding authority on the marriage contract? I'm not sure I understand the question specifically.
Because by a woman accepting the dowry, that puts the man in a position of power, so can say, I divorce you. And here, teaching the woman the verse of Quran, does that qualify for that? Whether this is accurate or not.
So it's certainly a commonly accepted story, and there's nothing that says that she has to receive any significant dower. There are also plenty of opinions that say that she can waive the dower or not collect it, that it doesn't actually have to be paid. So certainly that doesn't pose a problem. Whether it's a fair exchange from an ethical perspective is tricky. The other thing, of course, is that you asked about the relevance for the contemporary situation. In quite a number of Muslim-majority societies, extrajudicial talaq is no longer valid, and you have to go to a judge and get a divorce, right? And so certainly Muslims living in America, at least in theory, are obliged to process things through the secular legal system. And so in that case, what's being talked about there is different. I also think it's really important to recognize that the point of that story is a sort of ethical point about the importance of the Quran and the irrelevance of worldly wealth. The jurists are not interested, for the most part, in answering those kinds of ethical queries. They're interested in talking legally about something different, right? So it's a genre question as much as anything else.
Yeah, that allowed me to remember the second question I had. Also, the man and woman have the option of writing the contract mutually agreeable to both of them. And again, I add this from my own understanding, because of the level of the perhaps economic situation or social status of the woman were not as high as the man, so the man was in a better position to dominate the contract. But yet, the woman did have the option to, have the option to talaq or also other